Well, I am going to confess that when I saw that our theme for Lent was full to the brim, I was very excited because it reminded me of a scenario that happens in our household just about every day. The scenario goes something like this. I am preparing my morning cup of coffee. I fill my coffee cup pretty full because I'm a good Mennonite and I'm taught to make good use of the resources I have, including a coffee mug. So it gets very full of coffee. And so I heat up my coffee. And then I am also somebody with a big sweet tooth. And so I then need to fill my coffee cup with creamer. But to get the perfect ratio of coffee and creamer, that coffee cup is very full. And Jeremiah will look at me and look at the cup and say, "Really? You're going to spill that." And as much as I would love to say that he is wrong, 9 times out of 10 that is true, and there's coffee all over the kitchen counter. So when I saw this theme full to the brim for Lent, I thought, how does this idea of this coffee cup that I have every morning help me think about my own life? What is the metaphorical coffee mug of my own life, and what is filling that coffee mug? Now, what I'd like to suggest today is that if we are focusing on Paul's words to the Romans, where he talks about the importance of Jesus's lordship, that this might give us a clue to what needs to fill our metaphorical coffee cups. Now, it is no surprise to me that Lynn, as a younger person, was a better person than I. When I was a younger person, I heard this same text from Romans and thought, aha, I have the perfect equation for how to be saved. Paul gives it to me. Step 1, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord. Okay, Jesus is Lord. Step 1, done. Step 2, if you believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. Okay, yes, I believe. Then step 3, you will in fact be saved. And I thought, aha, I have arrived at the perfect equation for salvation. Confess with lips, believe in heart, salvation. Now this was a very elementary understanding of Jesus's lordship. And so what I'd like to suggest for us this morning is that if we think about what Paul is getting at in suggesting that we ought to confess Jesus's lordship, we find something that is far more meaningful. Now, to explore this, what I'd like to do is briefly trace out the ways in which the early Christians were making use of language that properly belonged to the Empire of Rome, including the language of Lord. So that's where we're headed. But all throughout the early Christian vocabulary, we find these words being used that are really the words of the empire. These are the words that the Empire of Rome is using, and the Christians are simply co-opting them. So I want to trace out a few of those words before we look at this idea of Lord, what it means to confess Jesus as Lord. So term number 1, the term gospel. Now, it might initially seem to us like, how could this word possibly mean anything other than the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ? But in fact, the term gospel was one that was used all throughout the Roman Empire prior to Jesus' time and simply meant a good news report, right? So this is on your morning news with Rome National News Network. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am happy to tell you the good news that we have conquered yet another barbarian nation. Congratulations on the good news of the empire. So good news, euangelion is the term here, is simply a good news report about what is happening for the empire. Christians take that term. The good news is actually the news of Jesus Christ. But that's not all. Christians also co-opt the term peace. Now, peace was a common term for the empire, the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. This was basically the propaganda slogan of the first century. How do we talk about how great Rome is? Well, we talk about the peace that Rome has brought. Never mind that that peace was brought by, basically killing off all their enemies, but still there is peace in the land because of Rome, the Pax Romana. And again, the Christians take over that term. And they say, no, the true peace, is the peace that Jesus has to bring. All right, next term, Son of God. Now, we might be thinking initially, how in the world could the title Son of God possibly have any kind of use outside of Christianity? Jesus, Son of God, these terms just kind of immediately come to our mind. And yet, if we look at sort of the larger history of the Roman emperors, in fact, the term Son of God was very much a political term. Jesus himself is born during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, and during Jesus' own life, Augustus dies and the empire passes on to his son Tiberius. Now, after Augustus's death, there start to be kind of rumors about Augustus, stories about Augustus, like, oh, he was a great dude, that Augustus. Back in the day of Augustus's ruling, he was almost like a god. In fact, yeah, I think Augustus was a god, wasn't he? Augustus really was a god when he was in power. And so if we start talking about the former emperor as being a god, then what does that make that emperor's son? Well, it makes him the Son of God. Tiberius, the emperor of the Roman Empire during much of Jesus' ministry, is the Son of God. And so if you were to walk into any Roman establishment of the first century and said, have you heard about the Son of God? Chances are folks would think that you're talking about Tiberius. Again, the Christians take over this term, and by ascribing to Jesus the title Son of God, there's a co-optation of the empire's language for the purposes of God. Now, all of this is a very long way of getting to where I want to get, which is, what is Paul getting at when he talks about confessing with your lips that Jesus is Lord? Well, I want to suggest that this title Lord is also like the other titles, like the other terms, gospel, peace, Son of God. The term Lord is also a part of the language of the empire. And in fact, we find this within some of our ancient inscriptions. We find an inscription that dates back to the first century, this phrase, hatu kosmos kuriou nerun, the Lord of the whole earth, Nero. Nero, the Emperor Nero, is given the title Lord. So what does this mean? What does it mean to think about Nero being the Lord? Well, here we might want a small little history lesson to know a little something about how Nero and the Christians got along. Spoiler alert, it wasn't great. So Nero was pretty well known for his dislike of Christians. In fact, during the first century, there is a large fire that breaks out in Rome. Houses are destroyed, businesses are destroyed, lives are lost. And that looks pretty bad if you are the emperor of that city. And so Nero thinks, okay, how can I kind of deflect the blame, not make this look like it's my fault? I know, I will blame the Christians for this massively destructive fire. And so the Christians are given the blame by Nero. But that's not all. Nero also wants to provide some entertainment for the people. And so what better way to entertain the masses than to feed Christians to the lions? Isn't that fun? Ha ha ha, look at the Christians getting eaten by lions. And finally, the one that I simply cannot imagine. Nero recognizes that his gardens are not properly lit at night. And so he burns the bodies of Christians within his gardens as human torches. Nero, the Lord of the whole earth. This is the setting in which Paul writes to the church in Rome, the church that is closest to this center of power. This is the church that Paul writes to. If you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord, that could be nearly a death sentence for Christians. Paul is encouraging them to make a proclamation out loud with their lips that Jesus is Lord and Nero is not. God's reign is the reign that is true. The reign of the emperor is not. And so to confess with our lips that Jesus is Lord and to believe in our hearts that God raises from the dead, that is a true act of faith. That is an act of faith that says, my metaphorical coffee mug is so full of the authority of Jesus' lordship over all the earth that there is no room for lords like Tiberius or Nero. Jesus is Lord. Now, I'd also like to suggest that if we follow Paul here, if we follow Paul in confessing Jesus' lordship, then there are also some other implications of that for us. There are implications for how we converse with one another, how we relate to one another. Paul says it this way. He says, look, there is no longer any distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all and is generous to all who call on him. And so Paul is writing to this church in Rome that is very concerned about these distinctions. We find, especially later in Romans chapters 14, chapters 15, Paul is trying to kind of help the Romans navigate some folks in the congregation who are very concerned with following particular religious traditions. Others who are like, well, yeah, but those aren't the biggest things. And so Paul is trying to navigate this church that thinks that human distinctions really are kind of a big deal. The distinctions between Jew and Greek would have been very obvious in the first century. I mean, for example, think of circumcision. This is not a small thing. There are probably some in the first century church who would say that the Jews are a cut above the Greeks, if you know what I mean. So we have these very clear distinctions from a human perspective. And yet what Paul says is that if we look at the true lordship of Christ, if we let our metaphorical coffee mugs be so full of the authority of Christ's lordship, we don't have room for those distinctions. Those distinctions are going to be like my coffee mug in the morning that as I keep pouring creamer in, eventually it just all spills over because there's simply no more room in the cup. If our cup is given to recognizing Jesus' lordship, there's no room for human distinction. So what does this mean for us? We're not in a situation where we are being fed to lions. We're not being blamed for massive fires in the city. But we here at Willow Avenue have also seen consequences of what it means to confess Jesus' lordship and to recognize the ways that that erases human distinction. We've been a congregation that has said that just as Jesus is Lord of all, and that just as Jesus welcomes all, we too welcome all. We do not attend to the distinction between Jew and Greek, black and white, Democrat, Republican, gay or straight. We are a congregation that affirms Jesus' lordship above all. And yes, we face some consequences for that. Some in our midst have had credentials revoked. We have had our membership within our founding denomination suspended because we as a congregation have recognized the importance of Jesus' lordship and the way that that makes claims on our lives as people of faith. And I think too, that as we are in this season of Lent, this invites us to consider how we can continue to recognize Jesus' lordship as a congregation, as individuals. What are the ways that we can follow Paul in claiming that Jesus is Lord and making that confession with our lips? My hope is that as we continue during the season of Lent, that we would be able to affirm with Paul what he says to the Romans in the final verse of today's reading. that everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Amen.